Picture this. It's the winter of 1241, and the most feared army in human history, the Mongol horde that had crushed empires from China to Eastern Europe, is fleeing in absolute terror through the frozen peaks of the Altai Mountains. These are warriors who showed no mercy, who laughed in the face of death, who had conquered nearly half the known world. But on this particular night, something made them run. Something that, according to the chronicles that survived, shouldn't have existed at all. What I'm about to tell you isn't just another creepy legend. This is a documented historical mystery that's been buried in Mongolian, Chinese, and Persian manuscripts for nearly 800 years, and the more you dig into it, the stranger it gets. Because here's the thing, multiple independent sources from different cultures all describe the same event, and they all agree on one terrifying detail. Whatever these hardened warriors encountered in those mountains, it was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. So stick with me, because we're going deep into one of history's most bizarre and unsettling mysteries. We're talking about strange tracks in the snow, unexplained disappearances, and a creature that allegedly decimated one of the most elite military units the world has ever known. And by the end of this video, you're going to understand why this story has haunted historians and cryptozoologists for centuries. Let me set the stage for you. The year is 1241, and the Mongol Empire is at the absolute height of its power. Under the leadership of Ögedei Khan, Genghis Khan's son, the Mongols have just finished devastating Eastern Europe. We're talking about the complete annihilation of Polish and Hungarian armies. Cities are burning, kingdoms are falling, and Europe is genuinely on the brink of total conquest. But then something happens that changes everything. Ögedei Khan dies suddenly in December of 1241, and according to Mongol tradition, all the princes and military commanders need to return to Mongolia for the election of the new great Khan. Now, one of these returning forces was a special unit, an elite reconnaissance group of about 300 warriors, led by a commander named Kenbish. These weren't just ordinary soldiers. These were the cream of the crop, veterans of countless campaigns, men who had survived the brutal training that made Mongol warriors legendary. Their job was to scout ahead, map terrain, and eliminate any threats before the main army arrived. Think of them as the special forces of their era. The route they chose took them through the Altai Mountains, this massive range that stretches across what is now Mongolia, Russia, China, and Kazakhstan. Now, the Mongols knew these mountains well. It was familiar territory, sacred ground to their ancestors. The Altai had always been considered a spiritual place, home to ancient shamanic traditions and old gods that predated even the Mongol tribes themselves. But it was also practical terrain. The mountain passes offered the fastest route back to the Mongolian heartland, and these warriors had traveled them many times before, according to a Persian chronicler named Rashid al-Din, who compiled histories of the Mongol Empire in the early 1300s based on official Mongol records and eyewitness accounts. Everything seemed normal for the first week of the journey. The weather was harsh, as you'd expect in December in the Altai Mountains, but nothing these experienced warriors couldn't handle. They made good progress, moving through the frozen valleys and over the snow-covered passes with the efficiency that made the Mongol army so formidable. But then, on the 8th night, something changed. The scouts who had been sent ahead to find a suitable campsite returned with a disturbing report. They had found tracks in the snow, massive footprints that didn't match any animal they recognized. Now, these men knew the wildlife of the region intimately. They could identify tracks from bears, wolves, snow leopards, you name it. But these prints were different. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but far larger than any human foot, measuring what was described as approximately 18 to 20 inches in length. Commander Kenbish, being a practical military leader, apparently dismissed the initial report. He assumed the scouts had seen bear tracks that had been distorted by melting and refreezing, a common occurrence in mountain conditions. The unit set up camp in a protected valley, posted guards as usual, and settled in for the night. This is where things get really strange, and this is where multiple historical sources start to align in ways that are genuinely unsettling. Around midnight, according to the accounts, the horses started going absolutely wild. Now, Mongol horses were famous for their toughness and their calm temperament. These animals had been in countless battles, had heard the screams of dying men, the clash of weapons, the chaos of warfare. They didn't spook easily. But on this night, every single horse in the camp was in a state of total panic, pulling at their tethers, trying desperately to flee. Some of the horses were so terrified that they broke their own legs trying to escape. The guards on the perimeter started shouting, and within seconds the entire camp was on high alert. The warriors grabbed their weapons and formed defensive positions, expecting an attack from rival tribes or bandits. But what happened next defied their military training and experience. From somewhere up in the mountains, above the campsite, came a sound that multiple sources describe in remarkably similar ways. It was a vocalization that started as a low rumbling, almost like distant thunder, but then rose into what witnesses described as a shriek or howl that didn't sound like any known animal. One account describes it as the sound of a woman screaming mixed with the roar of a bear, but magnified to an impossible volume. And then they saw it, or rather they saw something moving in the darkness beyond the firelight. The descriptions vary slightly between sources, but they all agree on the basic details. It was massive, standing upright like a human but far taller, estimated at somewhere between 8 and 10 feet in height. It was covered in dark hair or fur, and its eyes, multiple witnesses specifically mention the eyes, reflected the firelight in a way that seemed wrong, unnatural. The color is described as either amber or reddish, and the way it moved was unlike any bear or ape. It was purposeful, almost calculating. Now here's where Commander Kenbish showed the tactical brilliance that had kept him alive through dozens of campaigns. Instead of ordering an immediate attack, which would have been the typical Mongol response to any threat, he held his men back. He recognized that they were dealing with something unknown, and unknown factors in combat can be fatal. He ordered the warriors to tighten their defensive formation around the fires, to keep the flames burning high, and to make as much noise as possible with drums and shouting, trying to intimidate whatever was out there. For several hours, this standoff continued. The creature, or creatures because some accounts suggest there may have been more than one, circled the camp but didn't attack directly. The Mongol warriors, despite their legendary courage, were clearly rattled. These were men who had faced death countless times. But there's something primal about facing an unknown predator in the dark that taps into deep evolutionary fears. The waiting, the uncertainty, the sounds coming from the darkness, it was psychological warfare that even the most battle-hardened veteran would struggle with. As dawn started to break, the sounds and the presence seemed to withdraw back into the higher elevations. Commander Kenbish made the decision to break camp immediately and move to a different location with better defensive positioning. But as the warriors began to pack up, they discovered something that made their blood run cold. 3 of the perimeter guards were missing. Not dead, not wounded, just gone. Their weapons were left behind, lying in the snow. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away, except for those massive footprints they had seen earlier. Now this is where the story takes an even darker turn. A Mongol commander would never abandon his men, and Kenbish was no exception. He organized search parties to scour the area for the missing warriors. What they found, according to the historical records, was deeply disturbing. About half a mile from the camp, up a steep rocky slope that would have been extremely difficult to traverse in the dark, they found the bodies of 2 of the missing men. And the condition of these bodies was wrong, in ways that the sources struggle to adequately describe. The Mongol warriors had seen death in every conceivable form. They had witnessed the aftermath of siege warfare, close combat, exposure, starvation, you name it. But what they found on that mountainside was different. The bodies showed signs of massive trauma, with injuries that suggested incredible strength. Bones weren't just broken, they were crushed. But here's the really strange part. There were no bite marks, no evidence of predation in the way you'd see with a bear or wolf attack. It was as if the victims had been killed by something that had human-like hands, but possessed superhuman strength. The third missing warrior was never found. Not that day, not in subsequent searches. He had simply vanished into the Altai Mountains. Commander Kenbish made a decision that goes against everything we know about Mongol military culture. He ordered a full retreat. Not a tactical withdrawal, not a strategic repositioning, but an actual retreat at maximum speed away from that area. He pushed his remaining men hard, covering in 2 days what would normally be a 4-day journey, not stopping except when absolutely necessary. When they finally reached the lower elevations and relative safety of the steppes, Kenbish sent riders ahead to report what had happened. And this is crucial, because this is how the story entered the official records. In the Mongol system, commanders were required to submit data, reports of any unusual occurrences during military operations. These reports were taken seriously and archived. Kenbish's report was apparently so alarming that it reached the highest levels of Mongol leadership. Now, here's where we need to look at the broader historical context, because this incident in 1241 wasn't isolated. When researchers started digging into Mongol, Chinese, Tibetan, and Persian historical records from this period, they found multiple references to similar encounters in the Altai region. There are at least 7 other documented incidents between 1220 and 1260 where Mongol military units reported encounters with large, unknown creatures in these mountains. Some of these reports describe similar disappearances, others mention attacks on supply caravans, and a few describe finding massive tracks or hearing those same impossible vocalizations. What makes this even more interesting is that the indigenous peoples of the Altai region had their own long-standing traditions about these creatures. They called them by various names, the most common being Almas, or sometimes Kaptar. According to local shamanic traditions going back centuries before the Mongol encounters, these beings were considered guardians of the sacred places in the mountains, powerful spirits or ancient creatures that predated human civilization in the region. The descriptions from these indigenous traditions are remarkably consistent with what the Mongol warriors reported. They describe them as tall, hair-covered beings that walk upright, possess great strength, and generally avoid human contact but can become aggressive if their territory is invaded or if they feel threatened. Some traditions suggest they're nocturnal or crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk. They're said to be intelligent, capable of strategic thinking, and possessing an intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain that makes them nearly impossible to track or corner. Now, I know what you're thinking. This sounds a lot like the descriptions of Bigfoot or Sasquatch from North America, or the Yeti from the Himalayas, or the various other wild man legends that exist in cultures around the world. And you're absolutely right to make that connection. But here's what makes the Altai encounters particularly compelling from a historical perspective. These weren't legends or folklore passed down through oral tradition and embellished over centuries. These were contemporary military reports written by professional soldiers who had every reason to maintain their credibility and no incentive to fabricate stories about mysterious creatures. Think about it from Commander Kenbish's perspective. He was an elite military officer in an empire that valued strength, courage, and conquest above all else. Reporting that his unit had fled from an unknown creature and lost 3 men in the process was essentially admitting failure. In the Mongol military hierarchy, this could have serious consequences. Or his career and reputation. The fact that he made this report anyway, and that it was taken seriously enough to be archived and referenced by multiple later chroniclers, suggests that something genuinely extraordinary happened in those mountains. There's another fascinating element to this story that often gets overlooked: After the incident in 1241, there's evidence that the Mongol leadership actually altered their military routes through the Altai region. Several campaign maps and travel itineraries from the mid to late 1200s show Mongol forces taking longer, more circuitous paths that avoided certain valleys and mountain passes in the Altai range. This is significant because the Mongols were intensely practical people. They wouldn't inconvenience their military operations without good reason. Some researchers have suggested that the Mongol High Command, drawing on these multiple reports of encounters, designated certain areas of the Altai as hazardous territory. There are even suggestions, in some sources, that shamans were consulted, and they advised that certain mountain regions should be avoided, that they were the domain of ancient powers that should not be disturbed. Whether this was based on spiritual beliefs or practical concerns about unexplained dangers, the result was the same. The most powerful military force in the world essentially ceded territory to something they didn't understand and couldn't defeat. Now, let's talk about what this might have actually been. Because that's the question that's fascinated researchers for decades. The skeptical explanation is probably the most straightforward. Perhaps the Mongol warriors encountered a bear, possibly a particularly large brown bear, or even a group of bears, under conditions of poor visibility and high stress. The darkness, the fatigue from weeks of travel, the harsh weather conditions, all of this could have led to misidentification and exaggeration of a natural animal encounter. The problem with this explanation is that it doesn't account for several key details. First, Mongol warriors were intimately familiar with bears. They hunted them. They knew their behavior. They knew what bear attacks looked like. The chances of an experienced commander and 300 veteran soldiers all misidentifying a bear are pretty slim. Second, the description of the vocalizations doesn't match any known bear species. Third, the nature of the injuries on the recovered bodies, while it could potentially be explained by a bear attack, had characteristics that apparently struck experienced warriors as unusual. Another possibility is that they encountered a surviving population of a species thought to be extinct, or a species unknown to science. We know that the Altai region has been home to various large primates in the distant past. Gigantopithecus, a massive ape that stood up to 10 feet tall, lived in Asia until it went extinct roughly 100,000 years ago, though some cryptozoology STS have speculated it might have survived in isolated pockets for much longer. Could there have been a relict population of some large primate species surviving in the remote Altai Mountains as late as the 13th century? It's not impossible, though it would be extraordinary. Then there's the possibility that blends the natural and the cultural. Maybe there was a group of humans, perhaps outcasts or hermits, living in extreme isolation in the mountains, adapted to the harsh conditions in ways that made them seem inhuman to outsiders. There are historical examples of human populations developing unusual physical characteristics due to environmental adaptation and isolation. Combined with the psychological factors of darkness, fear, and cultural beliefs about mountain spirits, this could potentially explain the encounters. But here's what keeps this mystery alive, even after nearly 800 years. The sightings didn't stop with the Mongol accounts. Throughout the centuries there have been consistent reports from the Altai region of encounters with large, hair-covered bipedal creatures. Russian researchers in the 1950s and 60s conducted extensive investigations into what they called the Almas question, collecting hundreds of witness testimonies from across Central Asia. Some of these researchers, serious scientists with established reputations, concluded that there was sufficient evidence to warrant further investigation into the possible existence of an unknown primate species in the region. In the 1970s and 80s, several scientific expeditions were mounted specifically to investigate these reports. While none found definitive proof, they did document some intriguing physical evidence, including hair samples that couldn't be definitively identified, unusual track impressions in remote areas, and consistent testimony from local populations who described encounters with creatures matching the historical descriptions. More recent expeditions in the 1990s and 2000s have continued to find similar evidence, though nothing conclusive enough to settle the question once and for all. What's particularly interesting is how the modern reports align so closely with the historical accounts from the Mongol period. The descriptions of height, build, behavior, and habitat preferences are remarkably consistent across 7.5 centuries of reports. This consistency is either evidence of a real phenomenon that has persisted over time, or it's evidence of a cultural tradition that has shaped how people interpret unusual experiences in these mountains, making them see what they expect to see based on the legends they've grown up with. The skeptic in me wants to point out that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we simply don't have that level of evidence for the existence of large unknown primates in the Altai Mountains. No bones, no bodies, no DNA evidence that conclusively proves the existence of an unidentified species. The modern era, with satellite imagery, trail cameras, and advanced tracking technology, you'd think if there was a population of large primates in these mountains, we would have found them by now. But the historian in me can't ignore the weight of the historical record. The Mongol accounts weren't written by superstitious peasants prone to exaggeration. They were written by military professionals whose careers and reputations depended on accurate reporting. The fact that multiple independent sources from different cultures and time periods describe similar encounters in the same geographic region is genuinely intriguing. And the fact that these reports led to actual changes in Mongol military strategy and route planning suggests that the Mongol leadership took the threat seriously, whether it was a physical creature, a spiritual danger, or something else entirely. There's also something deeply compelling about the specific incident with Commander Kenbish and his unit. The details, the decision-making, the tactical responses, all of it rings true to what we know about Mongol military doctrine and behavior. The fact that Kenbish chose to retreat rather than pursue and destroy the threat is particularly significant. Mongol commanders were trained to be aggressive, to meet threats head-on. For him to make the decision to flee suggests he recognized that his unit was facing something outside their normal tactical parameters, something that posed a genuine danger his training and experience hadn't prepared him for. So where does this leave us? 800 years later, we're still trying to make sense of what happened in the Altai Mountains in the winter of 1241. Was it a misidentified natural animal? Was it an undiscovered species? Was it psychological mass hysteria brought on by stress and cultural beliefs? Or was it, as some of the more speculative researchers suggest, evidence of something truly unknown, a creature that has managed to evade scientific discovery for millennia by living in some of the most remote and inhospitable terrain on Earth? The honest answer is we don't know. And maybe that's okay. Maybe there's something valuable in having mysteries that remain unsolved, questions that we can't definitively answer despite our advanced technology and scientific methods. The story of the Mongol warriors fleeing in terror from something in the darkness reminds us that the world is bigger and stranger than we sometimes want to admit. It reminds us that even the most powerful, most confident civilizations can encounter things that humble them, that force them to acknowledge the limits of their understanding. What we do know for certain is that something happened in those mountains that was significant enough to be recorded in multiple historical sources, significant enough to influence Mongol military strategy for decades afterward, and strange enough that people are still talking about it and investigating it 8 centuries later. Whether that something was a flesh and blood creature, a cultural phenomenon, or something else entirely, it represents one of those fascinating intersections where history, mystery, and the limits of human knowledge all come together. And that's what draws us to stories like this, isn't it? The possibility that there are still unknowns out there, that despite our satellites and our science and our certainty about how the world works, there might still be surprises waiting in the remote corners of our planet. The story of Commander Kenbish and his warriors serves as a reminder that confidence and power don't always translate to understanding, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is admit that you've encountered something beyond your comprehension. So the next time you look at a map and see those vast mountain ranges, those remote valleys, those places where humans rarely venture, remember that there might be more going on there than we realize. Remember that the Mongol Empire, at the height of its power, backed down from something in the Altai Mountains, and ask yourself, what would it take to make the most fearsome warriors in history earn and run into the night? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.